Alvin Felzenberg has had an amazing career. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, he was the principal spokesperson for the 9/11 Commission. He served in 2 presidential administrations as an advisor to the Department of State and Defense. He's worked in Congress and New Jersey state politics as an advisor to New Jersey Governor Tom Keene. He has his PhD in politics from Princeton University, and he's been the fellow of the Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and a visiting professor of politics at Princeton. He currently teaches at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's been a commentator on major public affairs shows, including CNN's Crossfire, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and he's contributed to many other publications, including the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, and the National Review Online. He's the author of influential books, including his most recent, A Man and His Presidents, The Political Odyssey of William F. Buckley Jr. Syndicated columnist George Will says of A Man and His Presidents, William F. Buckley was the most consequential journalist of his era because he was much more than a journalist. This is a brisk, groundbreaking examination of Buckley's history-shaping role as a tireless and sometimes audacious political operative. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Alvin Felzenberg.
Thank you very much. My first advice to any of you who write books, try not to follow presidents. It's a hard thing to do, tell you. Should also say, and don't precede children and dancing dogs and other kind of things. It's tough. Listen, it's a great honor to be here. I've been at the Nixon Library many, many times, and every time I come, I learn more, I see more, and more about the many dimensions of the man come through. A couple of things about why I wrote this book, and we'll start with the quote that Jonathan just read from George Will. I make the argument, I go out on a bit of a limb. I say William Buckley was not just the most influential political commentator, probably in all of American history. He probably was the most influential private citizen this country has ever produced. The man never had a government job. He liked to remind people, one time he ran for public office, he got 13% of the vote. Never tried again. He did sit on some unsalaried boards and commissions at the behest of a few presidents, but that was basically it. Yet, he managed to help shape administrations. He helped elect 2 presidents, who I'm talking about tonight. 2 chapters on Richard Nixon are in this book, and 2 on Ronald Reagan. So I guess you can say he also liked to spend a lot of time in California, so he had very good sense regarding that. And the one thing you couldn't do about William F. Buckley Jr. was ignore him. I went through the papers of Democratic presidents, too. They clipped his columns, they circulated them, they underlined little comments and snide remarks and asked, what are we going to do about this? So the one thing you couldn't do with Bill Buckley and ignore him. Now, a couple of things before I get into the real talk. He was not your stereotypical conservative. He wasn't stodgy. He wasn't old. He wasn't, shall we say, a Chamber of Commerce type. He loved Rotarians, but no one ever called him one. He was the only fellow who would show up, only conservative at least, would show up on college campuses on a motorcycle and offer to give kids rides. He was a sailor. He was a musician. He was a masterful skier. All the things that you identify with fun and joy and love of life. When he made the cover of Time magazine for the first and only time, 1967, there was a cartoon by Art Levine, who you might know. He was a great caricaturist. And he presented William F. Buckley in a great drawing with the quintessential clipboard and the pen in his hand. And the caption was, William F. Buckley Jr., conservatism can be fun. Okay? He gave conservatism the smiling face. He was not preachy, he was not angry, he was not many of the things people associate with their old uncle, their grandparents, or their high school principal. He was completely the opposite. But more than that, he found a way to communicate his ideas across so many platforms. You wonder why it was hard even for presidents to ignore him. He ran a magazine, the leading conservative magazine in the country, still is in many ways. He had a column, newspaper column, that ran 3 times a week at its height. It was the 500 newspapers at a time when this country had 500 newspapers. Column ran for 40 years, from 1962 until the day he died, and he died writing a column, of all things. He was on television, 33 years the host of Firing Line, which is how most of us know him. And that got him even more influence. And I'll explain how it grew as we go along. That wasn't enough. 70 colleges a year, that's right, 7-0. He lost every debate on campus against liberal activists, but he was the one that most students wanted back. So I happened to attend one of these things at Princeton. He debated Arthur Schlesinger. The question was about the Vietnam War. You can imagine who took what side in the height of the war. Everybody voted for Schlesinger's position, but everyone wanted to have an ice cream or a beer with Buckley. I mean, you could just see where the lines formed. I never beheld anything like that. He wrote in general interest magazines. If it wasn't enough to have that, he wrote 50 books. He wrote for Esquire. He wrote for Sports Illustrated. He wrote for the American Yachtsman. He even wrote for a magazine that most of you don't read called Cigar Aficionado. I didn't even know it existed until I Googled William Buckley and Donald Trump, and it was the only mention I saw of William F. Buckley commenting on Donald Trump, and it was the year 2000. And the article appeared in the Cigar Lovers magazine. Wine Aficionado. Even Playboy. Imagine that. He gave one of the more colorful interviews, Playboy interviews, in all of the magazine's history. He used the opportunity to attack the Playboy philosophy, to attack Hugh Hefner, and attack the objectification of women, a story which I would say is back in the news. So after all of that, the very frustrated interviewer says, "Why are you talking to us then?" And the response was, "The only way I can communicate with my 16-year-old son." Right? Now, we want to go down to the younger grades. He's probably the only journalist to appear in animated form in a Walt Disney movie. The film was Aladdin, and the voice of William F. Buckley was the comedian Robin Williams. Now, I don't care who you like on television. I don't care who you read. It could be George Will. It could be Rachel Maddow. It could be Tucker Carlson. I don't care who you pick. None of these people have made it in a Disney movie. You want to talk about the influence of William F. Buckley, when you make it in an animated form in a Disney movie, after you've done Playboy, after you've done Esquire, American Yachtsman, all the rest of it, you're rather influential. You've crossed into the popular culture. That's what this was about. This was not William Buckley as the entertainer. This was William F. Buckley who wanted to move America. Move America where? Closer to his point of view. He was aware of his many gifts, but all these gifts were enlisted in the mission of his life. And what was that? I would say twofold. One was, you go to Washington and you see the president talked about the great monuments to our heroes and our founders. You go into the Jefferson Memorial, and there's that famous line, I've sworn eternal hostility over every form of hostility over the mind of man, every form of tyranny, pardon me, over the mind of man. Eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Case of William Buckley was moral equivalence. He began to feel after World War II, after 12 years of sacrifice and hardship, the Great Depression and the Great War, America wanted to kind of take it easy, to lift the reins, and perhaps we were getting a little soft. And he talked about moral equivalency. He was upset, and he kept reading cynical stories, cynical movies. The KGB and the CIA, they're all the same, right? They kill people, they blackmail people, they seduce, they lie, they break laws even in their own country and abroad. Therefore, there's no difference between the East and West. We have to accommodate. He said, rubbish. Let's talk about what those purposes are. Their values were different. The sacrifices were different. The cause was different. And our university should be teaching that. The second was he came of age. He was born in 1925, that glorious year in the Roaring '20s, where America was at peace, America was prosperous. A silent fellow named Calvin Coolidge was in the White House, who was famous for telling people they can't hang you for what you don't say. And he felt that the business of America was industrialization. I put it, the quote was, the business of the American people is business, not the business of America is business. What did he mean? People get up every morning, they go to work. In their quiet way, they contribute a great country. We want to keep taxes small. Great Reagan story. When Reagan was operated on for prostate surgery, he was recuperating, and he had an old West Point Army blanket on him, and where the knees, his knees were it was an open book with his reading glasses, and it was a biography of Calvin Coolidge. He'd fallen asleep as he was reading. And he wakes up, he realizes other people in the room, and it's 4 of his advisors. He says, glad you fellows are here. I just noticed that in the 7 years Calvin Coolidge was president, 6 years he was president, he cut taxes 4 times. How many times have I done it? And the response was, once, Mr. President. Well, boys, get back to the White House and get to work, right? Well, Reagan stunned America when he had the audacity to hang Calvin Coolidge's painting in the White House. Now, think about America in Coolidge's time. The heroes of the age were Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, people who were making things, not necessarily the government. When you talked about government, you're talking about Borough Hall, where you got a dog license. You weren't talking about Washington. And if Borough Hall couldn't solve your problem, if there was an emergency, we had the state for that. He was born in 1925. Now, by the time Buckley was 10, the New Deal was in full steam. Federal government was growing in power, growing in influence. And, of course, then the big war came. And suddenly, for the first time, America came out of a war, and we did not disarm. We did not disarm because of the nuclear age. And it was an existential threat to our country. So he decided he wanted to dedicate most of his life to kind of pulling America back to where it was as a young man. And that was the purpose of conservatism. And he used all those gifts to do that. Now, before we go into the how, let's tell a little bit more about where he came from. Now, most of you know Buckley from television. You see the suave, sophisticated, erudite man with multisyllabic words, right? And I used to love it because every time I would hear it, I'd go off to the dictionary, and that's how I studied for the vocabulary part of my SATs, right? It was either William F. Buckley. We didn't know in those days that you could go out there and actually take courses to raise your SAT scores. Everyone told us you can't, quote, study for them. Remember that? Well, I had William F. Buckley's column and words on television. I was always looked them up. There's always been one on the test or so. Yeah, you know, the poor man's William F. Buckley was the Reader's Digest vocabulary quiz. Those are the 2 ways. We did that. Anyway, this suave, urbanite sophisticate who spoke 3 languages with a British accent, who introduced, before there was Downton Abbey, there was Brideshead Revisited. Okay, this was like on just after the Nixon presidency ended. That's around the era of it. Well, this man was the great-grandson of an Irish farmer who left Ireland in the 1840s, settled in Ontario, had a large family. And William F. Buckley's grandfather was the sheriff of Duval County, Texas. Imagine that. Imagine that. Not a very wealthy family, not very aristocratic, not all the things I just described. This is such a young country when you think about it. From sheriff of Duval County, who knew Wyatt Earp, who knew the bounty hunter who brought in Billy the Kid. He used to entertain kids in the town by telling stories about these bounty hunters and sheriffs in the Old West. This is William Buckley's grandfather. He was a bit of a nonconformist, just like William Buckley would be. He was the only sheep farmer in a state full of cattle. Obviously, the farm failed, and he went into politics, like most Irish Catholics of his era, except it was in the South and not Chicago or Brooklyn. Okay, that was the father's side. Now, Sheriff John, or Sheriff Buckley, had a number of children. And, of course, the one we're going to talk about is Bill's dad, William F. Buckley Sr. Well, started life with absolutely nothing. Sheriff John dies just about the time he's going to start the University of Texas. And he decides he's going to put himself and his I think there were 4 other siblings, through college. An interesting time at that time. He starts college, and he gets called into the dean's office. His first response is, "What did I do?" Right? Like most of us would. Turns out a state senator wants to meet him. State senator, what's that, right? And the state senator says, "Son, you don't know me, but you're Sheriff John's son, aren't you?" "Yes." He said, "Well, you know, your father, the sheriff, broke up a plot to assassinate me when I was a DA. This is the kind of Wild West it was." And he said, "Well, I'm glad you survived." He said, "Well, so am I. But let me tell you something. I don't have a lot of money, but I have a lot of influence. And some of my influence is with the Texas Land Grant Office. I'm going to get you a job because I know your father didn't leave you very much." Well, from that little job, 5 Buckleys get educated, get a college education. He then decides he's going to go into the oil business, becomes a wildcat oil man. He makes and loses several fortunes before William F. Buckley Jr. and his brothers and sisters are even born. He learns 2 things. He does not like crony capitalism. He had seen the powers of the oil companies, again, in the 20s, the same people who gave us the good things under Calvert Coolidge, a presidency before, were corrupting the oil wells. They were selling government rights, and Teapot Dome is what you know about it. Well, that's what happens when you have crony capitalism and your pals are invited to dip into the government till. Well, if you don't have crony capitalism, you have a simpler tax code, right? You don't need lobbyists to protect your little loophole in the tax code. Well, a lot of this rubs off on the son very, very quickly. Well, the mother, William F. Buckley's mother came from the opposite side of the social scale. She was the New Orleans debutante daughter of one of the wealthiest textile merchants of the South in those days, in post-Civil War America. Now, we had a bit of a rumpus last summer about Robert E. Lee statues and all of this. Remember in New Orleans, they took Robert E. Lee down in the middle of the night. Remember, they wrapped him up in what, a bed sheet, right? And they took him down. Well, my father used to say, when you take down a fence, find out why it was put up. Well, I think we know why it was put up, but what I discovered was 3-year-old Eloise Steiner, who will become William F. Buckley's mother, was the 3-year-old little girl who put the bouquet of roses at the base of the statue when it was dedicated. It gives you a sense of her father's influence. Well, they marry in 1916, and they have 10 children. Yes, you heard that right, 10. Bill was 6 of 10. I don't know how many of you are from large families, but you know, the first time a child falls down the steps, you know, disaster, he's never going to make it. What did I do wrong? You have to watch him every minute. By the time the 6th one comes along, you know, get up, can't you see I'm watching television? You'll be fine. Your brother's made it, your sister's made it. Stop crying, stop whining, you know. Right, suck it up, kiddo, right? Well, so you're number 6, how do you get attention? You get attention by your ability to speak, by the things you say at dinner, by the things you say to entertain your father, right? And he was the apple of the parent's eye. He was the most precocious of all 10. He once said that his childhood really was a life in Arcadia. Interesting. The same line that you hear in Brideshead Revisited, where their days in Arcadia are numbered, right? A war is coming, it's going to break things up, and, well, same line. Private tutors, music tutors, Latin tutors, French tutors, after-school activity with the other 9 children, you know, sailing on Monday, horseback riding on Tuesday, tennis on Wednesday, till he went to stop. There's only 5 days, plus, okay. It was a charming existence. Well, I don't think I would have liked him all that much at the time because his was spoiled. Let's face it, he was from even though his father was self-made, he was from a very wealthy family and very sheltered, much more important than wealthy. The entire world, the confidence he had came from the fact he had a large family. He was the star of the family. Anything he did, the family got involved in. I will point out, all of his brothers and sisters, in some way or other, got involved in National Review, whether they were on staff or they were helping the process along. All of the brothers and sisters wind up working in his campaign, his ill-fated campaign for mayor of New York, and his brother's successful campaign for senator from New York, all for one and one for all. You come out of that kind of environment, you're pretty self-confident, perhaps a little too self-confident. So he goes off to boarding school at a time when America is feeling the weight of the struggle over whether we should enter the war in Europe at the time. Some of you just saw the Darkest Hour film about Churchill. And you saw the scene where Franklin Roosevelt tells Churchill that we can't do anything to help you. We signed this Neutrality Act, and we can't give aid to belligerents. Well, this will change during the Roosevelt years. The Churchill movie takes place in May 1940, and it ends in May 1940. Through the rest of 1940 and all of 41, the battle becomes, should we help England? How are we going to help England? And you heard of Lend-Lease. You heard of, we can't get money out of Congress, so we will lend them destroyers, and they will give us bases. And we'll do anything we can to help them. Well, that segment should be the sequel that picks up where the movie ends. During those days, Buckley's parents were part of the old America First. They did not want to get involved. When I left the movie with a young person the other night, he said to me, well, why was America so much against helping England? I said, it wasn't that it didn't want to help England, it was that the memory of World War I was so fresh and so bitter. The trench warfare, the chemical warfare, and of course the broken promises of the war to end wars, make the world safe for democracy. Maybe just we don't want to sacrifice our young men one more time. And it was Pearl Harbor, of course, shook us out of that. I was trying to explain that to him. But anyway, the Buckleys were isolationists. He goes to a school in Millbrook. The boarding school was called Millbrook. A tad out of place, shall we say. Isolationist in an area where most of the people were pro-Britain, pro-involvement. A Catholic in a school that was overwhelmingly Protestant. And extremely confident and self-assured. Well, but with a shrewd sense of marketing. To commemorate his passage into young adulthood, his parents bought him a sailboat. So he calls the sailboat Sweet Isolation, knowing that every time he won a race, and got a ribbon, the name of the ship, maybe the little sailboat, would be in the newspaper, and his father's politics would be promoted. So he had this sense of marketing very, very early. Well, the Army comes after that. Well, I will point out one of the themes in this book, before we get to the real story that I'm going to tell you in a minute, is the William F. Buckley we saw on the set, and you'll see a little bit of it later in my talk, was a work of self-improvement and self-consciousness all the time. He did not end life the way he began it. He realized if you come on like little Lord Fauntleroy and tell people you don't like their politics, you don't like the way they dress, you may not like their family, you don't certainly like their religion, and their parents dress them funny, you don't get too many friends. You don't get liked very much. So for William F. Buckley, this cultural clash came in the Army. He gets drafted when he's 17, so he doesn't even bother with college yet because he knows he's going to be drafted very quickly. And he wants to be he wants to go into officer candidacy school. First time in his life, he meets people from backgrounds different from his. Polish kids from Chicago, Jews and Italians from New York, African Americans who actually were in other stations of life than domestic servants. Perhaps he saw life in the South. He hadn't envisioned any of that before. And at one point or other, he also had this habit that he didn't like to take orders from people who either were not from his social class or not from his level of education. Well, he finds a commanding officer who happened to have gone to Yale, but happened to have had a very working class background, who gives him, let's say, a come to Jesus moment, right? Yes, a big one. Now, kiddo, you want to lead other people. You want to rise in this world. You have to understand what responsibility is. You may not like these orders, but they are orders. You're going to carry them out, or you're going to be busted to private again. Secondly, whatever you think of me and the orders I give you, I am aware that these draftees, these 18-year-old kids, can come out of this basic training program and die in the front a week after. Well, funny. He had a photographic memory. And 40 years later, when he is beginning to say, well, how many soldiers are enough when Lyndon Johnson doesn't seem to know what he's doing about the war? Are we going to bomb, and bomb for what purpose? We're going to bomb to get them to the peace table. Why will they come to the peace table if we're bombing them? So send more bombs in, send more soldiers in. We wound up with 500,000 soldiers. And Westmoreland, the general at the time, says about a month before Johnson pulls out of the race, we need another 200,000. Buckley, who was the hawk, writes a column saying he should be denied the request. And he quotes what the commanding officer told him. Lyndon, don't you realize these people coming out of basic training can be slaughtered in a week? What's your strategy? Why are you doing this? So it's something about Buckley. He's always, whenever he heard something, it stayed on the hard drive, right and back, and he would find a way to use it. That come to Jesus talk must have been a very colorful one. It shook him to the core. By the time he enters Yale, you begin to see the kind of man that will emerge later. He becomes an instant star. He's captain of the debating team. He's editor of the Yale Daily News. He's admitted as Skull and Bones in some of the finest societies there. He's a good scholar. I told you we had some great athletic prowess, but interesting, not on teams. He excels in sports where you're really competing against yourself. So we're talking against skiing, right? Horseback riding. We're not talking soccer, we're not talking football. He was a decent tennis player, but not on the tennis team. You see the kind of fellow, but he was probably the most successful fellow on campus. And he was the one everyone wanted to be near. A sense of the family, just one more time. To be the editor of the Yale Daily News, you had to do two things. You had to outwrite everybody. You had to have more column inches than anybody else. The stories had to be good. They had to be accurate. They had to be checked. Second, you had to sell more ads than anyone. So I was reading his editorials, and I was seeing what was going on in 49, 50, the year that he was the editor. And I began to see lots of ads are appearing in the Yale Daily News for ladies' apparel in stores that are in New Hampshire, in Northampton, Massachusetts, and Poughkeepsie, New York. I began to say to myself, Yale was only for men then. And if you're going to buy a Christmas present or for your mother or a Valentine's gift for your sweetheart or something for your sister, why would you go from New Haven to Northampton, Massachusetts, or Vassar? And I realized that, yes, Poughkeepsie. Buckley had a couple of sisters at Vassar, which is in Poughkeepsie, and a couple of sisters going to Smith, which is in Northampton. Well, guess what? 6 sisters. Mrs. Buckley had an account. Well, when I studied accounting in college, all of you do your taxes, and you look at corporate records and corporate annual reports. You total up the company's assets, your fixed assets, your receivables and all that, and you put this thing down, goodwill. And I mean, what's goodwill? Well, you can't put a number on it, but if you want to keep the business, it's kind of worth a little bit on the side. Well, they wanted to keep her account. You had 6 daughters, so they're buying ads in the Yale Daily News, knowing they're not going to get any customers. Well, that's an example of what I'm talking about. And you'll see this many, many, many times. All right, well, let me go to cut to the chase now. Buckley gets, first of all, a couple of things are going on at Yale when he's there, in the world and in the United States. In the world, there's something called the Cambridge Five. It was an espionage matter where the Soviet Union, Stalin particularly, began to infiltrate the upper classes of Britain, the best and brightest, if you will, turn them into communists, turn them into spies for him. So you've heard some of these names, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess. When I was in college, it turned out it was exposed that the gentleman who recruited all these kids was a fellow named Anthony Blunt, who was the curator of the Queen's Art Collection. They came that close to the top of British society. Buckley's sitting in his dorm. How did this happen? We're not talking about the poor proletariat here. We're talking about the young aristocracy who's supposed to be taking over Britain. Why? Well, because they believed in this stuff. They believed that at the end of the war, communism would conquer the world and the end of all human misery would come. They weren't doing it for the money. Well, what's going on at home? Well, at home, there's an exhibit on it down the hall. We had a thing called the Alger Hiss case. This is the case that would make Richard Nixon famous. We have a member of the State Department who's being groomed to be even a hired member of the government than before, is accused. It looks like Cary Grant, suave, sophisticated, tailored clothing, clerk for Oliver Wendell Holmes, friend of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. He stands accused by an editor of Time magazine named Whittaker Chambers of having been a spy during World War II for the Soviet Union. Everybody believed that Whittaker Chambers was crazy and a liar and worse, and rallied around Alger Hiss. Everybody but one freshman congressman who this building honors, a freshman named Richard Nixon. And he just smells a rat, to coin a phrase. There's something wrong with this testimony. When they ask him if he knows Mr. Chambers, his accuser, he says he doesn't know anybody by that name. Well, Nixon stays up all night. Why didn't he just say no? Well, Nixon, having been an excellent student at Duke, figured out that Hiss was trying to avoid a, quote, perjury trap. And so Nixon said, well, did he have another name? Well, Nixon comes in the next day. Mr. Chambers, did you have any other names, aliases, and you're in the Communist Party, and the case really cracks wide open, all right? So again, what was Hiss trying to do? He was not a poor fellow trying to up his wages with workers' paradise. He was trying to advance a cause. Well, what does the West offer? Now, here's the 9/11 parallel, because we used to say, if you catch anyone who was in Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they could tell you out of matchbook what they believe. They want to kill us, right? We are heathens. We deserve death. You can't do anything to them, because if you kill them, you're doing them a favor. They go up to heaven, and all these things are awaiting them in paradise. Well, there is an office in the State Department that's supposed to do public diplomacy. Well, what do they tell us we're about? What are we trying to do to counter the propaganda, particularly with young, vulnerable Muslim youths who are 16 years old? They come from families of 20 children sometimes. They have no hope of life on earth, but if they do all this other stuff, they might get it at the other end. Well, we're for diversity. That's very nice. We're for pluralism. That's very nice. We're the First Amendment. Well, that's even nicer. But what does that get you? These are all processes. So Buckley begins to say there is a difference between good and evil. There's a difference between right and wrong. And no matter how this sounds, the Judeo-Christian tradition is better than the others. The others are free to flourish here. They're free to be tolerated. But the American creed says, the Christian creed says, the Jewish creed says that men and women are created in God's image. Out of that comes every source of justice, the beginning of any kind of liberty and any hope of democracy. Why? Well, if you strike out at man, strike another person, you're striking at God. You cheat another person, you're cheating God. You lie, you're bearing false witness in front of whom? I can go on. And then he says, darn it, why isn't Yale teaching that? They're teaching it like they would teach any other religion. There's no difference from the work Margaret Mead is doing in the Polynesian Islands, or National Geographic is discovering in other parts of the world, and that's how they're teaching Christianity. With the economics department, it's even worse. I had a chance when I was writing about Ronald Reagan to look at the kind of books Reagan was reading when he was in college. In 1930, he was I think, a freshman at Eureka. All the economic textbooks taught free market. 1946, Bill is at Yale. Something has changed. We're talking about mixed economies. We're talking about this great experiment with Clement Attlee. The Churchill movie doesn't end when Churchill is thrown out of office. He will be thrown out of office as soon as he wins the war. And a labor government starts nationalizing everything. And it's not till Maggie Thatcher that we begin to privatize again. Well, that's what they're teaching. So he decides, when he graduates, he's going to tell Yale off, right? spunky guy, arrogant guy. Well, he's going to write a book that calls it God and Man at Yale. And he can't get a publisher because most of the publishers went to Ivy League schools. They're not going to attack their alma mater. And half these publishers are sitting on the Yale board. They don't have anything to do with that. So he finds an obscure publisher. Now, I don't want to go over my time, but I got to tell you this one. If any of you want to go into business and you don't have enough capital, get somebody bigger than you to pick on you. Make them know your name. So Yale plays right into Buckley's hands. The president of Yale sends a letter to 10 friends. And what should we do with this upstart fresh kid, basically, we got on our hands? 9 say ignore it. Now this is how life at the top works. Felix Frankfurter, Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, writes back, Harvard man, spending all of his time in chambers dealing with this fresh upstart. So he's trying to, his friend is the president of Yale. What do I write back? I say, number 1, ignore it. Number 2, if you can't ignore it, do what Yaleys do so well, condescend. Well, how do we condescend? Well, look, we are so proud that a recent graduate of our institution has shown the world that he deserved to place out of English composition. Well-written sentences in this book, can't deny it. We look forward to his next book after his ideas have crystallized. It's called Condescend. Well, that's not good enough for Yale. They go to the Atlantic Monthly, edited by a Yale man. He hires McGeorge Bundy, who will now make history later on, 10 years later, as John F. Kennedy's national security advisor, one of the planners of the Vietnam War. Right? He's now a rising star at Harvard. McGeorge Bundy writes a review for the Atlantic, blowing Buckley to smithereens. So what does Yale do? Well, they then print 2,000 reprints of this to hand out at the Yale commencement. Well, suddenly, if you missed it, the world now knows that this one little kid, the elephant is scaring the mouse, is what one of the reviewers said. Well, one thing about this country, if you create a controversy, there's always one person who's going to say, I want to hear from the other side, correct? And this person turns out to be a guy you will hear of again, Mike Wallace. Outside, you see Mike Wallace interviewing Tricia Nixon about her father's piano playing, among other things here. Mike Wallace is also an upstart starting out. And he has a late night, early morning, like 1 a.m. show. And he's got Buckley on. He goes, sitting next to me is this young man who started a fight with his alma mater. He's impeccably tailored, very well spoken, very, very bright. War veteran in World War II, skull and bones, debater, newspaper editor, the quintessential Yaley. Why do they hate you so much? That was the question. And then you get these Shakespearean cadences. A Star is Born. He has to hire 2 secretaries to deal with the fan mail. He's one of the most sought-after speakers in America. He's on his way. I mean, now he says, having taken on Yale, that was just a warm-up act. I'm going to bring down nothing less than the most powerful person in the world who just won the last war. Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'm going to read him out of the Republican Party once and for all. Imagine that in 1952. Wow. So why does he dislike Ike so much? Well, it's not about Ike. It's about, sound familiar? For 5 elections, the Republican Party promised the American people that they were going to repeal the New Deal. Creeping socialism. We're going to kill it in its cradle. We're going to repeal it. We can do it better than they can. We can turn it over to the private sector. And of course, they lose 4 elections, 5 elections, okay? And the 6th one, Eisenhower, too, is saying this, but he's also saying, John Foster Dulles, is this on? Can something happen? Okay, John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State. Are you sure this is on? Okay, it's not on, but I thought. Can this come on? Can this come on? Yoo-hoo. All right. While we're getting some help, John Foster Dulles talks about rollback of the Stalin Empire. We're going to roll him back out of Poland. We're going to roll him out of East Germany. Remember, the war ends, and America celebrates. And the famous photo you have of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square, and all the boys are home, except all the Russian boys stay where they were. They just stay in place, right? Dulles talks about rolling them back. Well, guess what? Ike becomes president. The New Deal is safe. In fact, it's even increasing government spending, and nothing's done about that. So he's going to start a magazine to move America rightward. And that magazine will be called National Review. And as long as Ike's in the White House, nobody pays much attention, because Ike is clearly the most famous man in America. He can afford to ignore him, right? But as Ike's days are wearing down, a growing fight is appearing in the Republican Party, which will be settled in 1964 between Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater wins the California primary, not by a lot, and ever since, the Republican Party has been much more conservative. We think of that as a realigning election, meaning people are shaken out of conventional voting habits and begin to vote for a party they never once thought they would. Goldwater carries the South for the first time. Lyndon Johnson carries safe New England, and things begin to change. Well, the second great act appears for Buckley. He decides to run for mayor of New York the year after his hero, Barry Goldwater, loses the largest presidential, by the largest margin anyone in American history. 1965, Bill decides to run for mayor of New York, the most liberal city. And his opponents are John Lindsay, a Republican liberal congressman from New York City, when we had liberal Republicans, and Abe Beame. And lo and behold, they didn't know that Buckley was a star debater at Yale, and they never thought this would matter. New York had 12, I got the digits reversed, 12 newspapers. Imagine that? 12 newspapers in one city. They all went out on strike the second week in October, and they won't come back till early November. So the electronic media, okay, begins to take up the slack. So they have something like 30 debates. This is how Buckley came into my consciousness. I was 16 years old. I'm watching one of these debates. Mr. Buckley, how would you characterize your two opponents? Oh, that's very easy, he would say. Mr. Lindsay stands at 6'4", which makes him the tall liberal in the race. Mr. Beame stands at 5'1", which makes him the short liberal in the race. So I would say that the difference between my two opponents is more biological than ideological. I had two new words to look up. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, I was already taking biology. We were cutting up frogs. That was all fine. But, ideological, never heard that one anywhere. 16 years old. What are we talking about? It's not even on the Beatle records. And Mr. Buckley, what will you do if you're elected? Well, in the remote, there was a remote possibility that I became mayor and I was elected. My God, I would demand a recount. Well, so demand a recount is one of my chapters. Well, he's running for many reasons. He wants to give conservatives a shot in the arm. They just took hell of a beating the year before. And he wants to show that conservatives have something to offer in this perpetual urban crisis we never seem to get out of. So he comes up and says, why can't I ever get a taxi when it's raining out? He comes up with the idea of why can't safe drivers with no criminal record rent out space in their car? You know it as Uber, right? And then why can't they do it with their house? Well, you know this as Airbnb, right? Bicycle lanes, which Koch will put in eventually. Other things that we hear, welfare reform, which the kind of welfare reform, like how are we trying to help these women by cutting off food and drugs and daycare? Hello? Why don't we give them incentives to get off welfare and try to make private sector jobs more appealing? So why don't we let them keep some of their benefits while they're being trained? And you know all this, Clinton, Gingrich. Anyway, he comes out of this thing a star. Well, he lost the election, Barry Goldwater said, but he won the campaign. How am I doing on time? All right. Goldwater said he lost the election, but he won the campaign. Why? Because all of the producers of major shows are watching this. So he loses the election, gets 13% of the election in November. February 1, firing line appears. It will run for decades. He uses his clout from the campaign to do something he's always wanted to do. He wants to weed out the bigots and the conspiracy theorists and the racists from the conservative movement. He decides any movement, whether they're labor unions, whether they're feminists, whether they're gays, whether they're conservatives, you name the movement, they will always be defined by their enemies, by the weakest link in the chain. And one of our weak links is this John Birch Society. Be real quick. John Birch Society was founded to honor an American hero who was killed by the Chinese government in the Korean War. Complicated, but that's the fact. And it was started by a fellow named Robert Welch. Robert Welch startles the country by announcing that, I used to say we go from the Bircher to the birther movement, in a way, if you lived through it. Right. Welch was going on telling the world that Dwight Eisenhower was a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. And that Buckley said he's telling the parents of America that their kids hit the ground on Normandy to make this country enslaved to the Soviet Union. This man is bonkers. Well, he's not so bonkers to a lot of the conservative movement. They're saying, why aren't you picking fights with liberals? He hates Khrushchev, you hate Khrushchev. He wants less government, you want less government. And he goes to war with Welch. And that's the beginning of, Buckley said his legacy might have been starting the conservative movement, but he's proudest of having rid the movement, or kept the movement free of bigots, anti-Semites, racists, conspiracy theorists. He lost donors, he lost board members, he lost writers, but he won that war, to quote Goldwater. Well, candidates begin coming, and 1968 is appearing, and Nixon wants Buckley's endorsement, and Reagan wants Buckley's endorsement. Reagan will get in very late and get out very early. It was not a very successful campaign. And then there's Nelson Rockefeller. Buckley decides he would talk to them all, but he decides that Rockefeller is too liberal. I wanted to make the Republican conservative, and what am I dealing with him? One down. And he said, we're still living in a time where government experience matters. I mean, we're not living in such a time now. But remember, Obama could get elected with 1 or 2 years in the Senate, decide to run for president. Now we have a president who boasts that he had no government experience, and it doesn't matter because look how well the politicians have done. But in 1968, he was saying, we need Ronnie for the future. He's been governor for a year. No. And he says, we're going to hold him because if we have another defeat, conservatism's dead. They're going to say it wasn't just Goldwater. So he says, by process of elimination, I think Richard Nixon is a man I can do business with. Aha! So Richard Nixon appears, I'm going to show you some footage now, on firing line. Buckley is dueling with him. He's trying to draw him out. What Buckley wants to do is make the Republican Party the party of ideas. One thing about Bill, he was very good at emulating his enemies. So if the liberals had 1,000 organizations to advance their cause and candidates, if they had intellectuals fueling their cause, Schlesinger, Galbraith, we're going to grow our own, and we're going to be a mirror to them. And I want to test Nixon out to see how well he gets that. And here we go.
In 1946, at the age of 33, Lieutenant Commander Richard Nixon was doing a little legal work for the Navy in Baltimore. 6 years later, he was Vice President of the United States. 8 years later, he lost the presidency in the closest election in American history. 2 years after that, he lost an election in California. And as if to prove the depths of his despondency, he came to live in New York City, where anything can happen, and has. In 4 years, Mr. Nixon suddenly emerges as the leading Republican, not contender, but the leading person in all of the speculation having to do with the forthcoming presidential election. Let me give you an example. We have to wait for a Democrat to suggest that the post office be turned over to a public corporation. Can you imagine if that had been a suggestion made by the Postmaster General of President Goldwater? Can you imagine what Herblock, for instance, would have done the next day? It would have been the end of it.
I know what he's done to me.
Yes. Yes, he's a very expressive man, but the point surely is that the GOP, it strikes a lot of people, as a result of its failure to appreciate the innate strengths of its own position, is all of a sudden in a situation where the other side is picking up, essentially conservative à perçu and running off with it. You have Richard Goodwin, former assistant to Kennedy, saying the big fight in the 70s will be over the size of government.
And also advocating that in the handling of the problems of the nation, we must go to local responsibility and diffuse power rather than concentrate it, which of course is completely unfashionable to the liberal community of even 5 years ago.
Yeah, but meanwhile you've got the Republicans who are afraid that if they get caught saying that kind of thing, they're going to be considered reactionary. And
let me at least keep the record straight on one point. The Republicans have said that too. They said it earlier. Mr. Goodwin actually is following good Republican doctrine. And I should also point out that Robert Kennedy, the senator from New York, has, as you know, recently been advocating the private sector moving in to this whole area of providing more jobs for Negroes.
His family.
That's right.
Suppose you had been President of the United States in 1963. Do you think that you could have proposed a tax bill that would have reduced the taxation in the upper brackets from 91% to 70%? Or is this the kind of thing that only a Democrat can do, because only a Democrat could do so cleanly, i.e. without harboring the suspicion that here was a Republican favoring the rich and so on and so forth?
I've heard this argument made, and I should point out incidentally that in 1960, this was before the elections, that I was in a group within the administration that favored a tax reduction at that time. That position did not prevail. Now, to answer your question, had I had that opportunity in 1963, I think that I or another Republican could have done it. But I will agree it is less suspect when a president who supposedly represents the people and the underprivileged advocates lowering taxes for the higher incomes than it is for somebody who happens to be a member of a party who is supposed to represent the other.
Isn't it?
Herb Bloch was a cartoonist for the Washington Post. Very, very liberal, hated Nixon's guts. But if you look at any of the Herb Bloch cartoons, you could see how vicious they were. They were extremely effective. You heard Nixon, who wasn't supposed to have much of a sense of humor, say, well, you saw what Herb Bloch did to me, okay? Well, what Buckley is saying is, you guys were president, vice president for 8 years. Kennedy's running on Get America Moving Again, and he proposes tax cuts. And you didn't have it. You had a chance. You didn't do it. Why didn't you do it? So therefore, well, I was on the losing side of the debate. You heard Nixon still courting Buckley come up with that as a true answer. It was a fact. But he's saying, how come they can get away with it? A Democrat can cut taxes and get away with it and not be accused of being selfish, doing it for his donors, doing it for his businessmen. Well, guess what? Nixon becomes the man a year or two after this who decides to go to China, right? Nixon in China becomes a new phrase, meaning that no Democrat could go to China because Republicans would call them soft on communism. But if Nixon does it, it's okay, okay? Well, then Bill Clinton, only a Democrat, cut welfare. Only a Democrat working with Newt Gingrich. So we're about a year or two ahead of this. So I'm not saying Nixon went to China because of Buckley, but I'm saying Buckley is trying to see if Nixon is at all attentive to that kind of irony. That's where I'm going. Well, I want to get to the questions, but a little more. It becomes what I told Jonathan in an email, a bit of a rocky relationship. Nixon said, Buckley, I can do business with him. Well, they do. You saw in the Nixon library, there's the Silent American speech, right, where Nixon announces his Vietnamization strategy. Well, the White House is filled with telegrams of congratulations and support, and the hard hats are waving flags, and suddenly we're getting somewhere, we thought. And Buckley organized a campaign. He organized a campaign through National Review, through organizations he was running, through speeches he was making. We got to stand by our president. You heard some of this tonight in the State of the Union. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Very good relationship. Finally, 1970, 5 years after Bill loses the mayoralty, his brother Jim is running for Congress, a senator from New York, three-man race. Charles Goodell was a liberal Republican appointed by Rockefeller to succeed Bobby Kennedy. Father of the current president of the NFL, in case you're wondering, Goodell's on my mic, Goodell's. Democrat was a congressman named Richard Ottinger. And Buckley runs. With Nixon's help, the White House's help, his brother wins against a Republican and against a Democrat in the most liberal state in the country. They're getting along fine. But then we have this thing called policy, okay? Some of you may still be in school or taking classes or thinking back to your history classes. Well, we have a conservative here who wants less government. Well, that was the whole point of this. Reduce it, make it weaker, make it closer to Calvin's day. If I were to stand before a class now and say, I won't give you the president's name, but I'm going to read the record of what he's done, and you tell me what party he belonged to. Okay, he created the environmental, Environmental Protection Agency. He established OSHA. He put in wage and price controls. He advocated health care with a single-payer provision. He desegregated Southern schools. He tripled the National Endowment for the Arts budget. And he wanted a guaranteed income to the working poor. You would probably think, if I did not identify his party, he would be a Democrat. Well, you can imagine Nixon had his problems with the conservatives, big time. And Buckley forms a group called the Manhattan 12, which is basically Buckley and a number of other heads of conservative organizations. They confront the White House and they decide they're going to suspend support. And they suspend support and negotiations again begin. And lo and behold, George McGovern gets nominated for the Democratic nominee. He wants to pull out of Vietnam in an hour and a half. And he will crawl to Hanoi on his knees, he says, if they don't stop the war. And he will redistribute income. One of his great plans was $1,000 for everybody, if you need it or not, and that sort of thing. Well, suddenly Nixon's the lesser evil again. So they're back allied, and then comes Watergate. And you can read the Watergate chapter. Very early on, Buckley says, I think Nixon ought to resign, not because I think he's guilty, and not because he may be guilty, but he's taking the country away from more pressing problems, and he'll be remembered more for having spared America 2 years of grief and going on as a statesman. And, to paraphrase Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca, we'll always have China, okay, instead of we'll always have Paris, right? Well, the advice isn't taken, and of course, Buckley writes, now, alas, he's being thrown out with the chicken thieves. But he didn't think Nixon should go to jail. He was very happy that Ford punished him and pardoned him. It's been a long day for me, plus a State of the Speech address. He pardoned him, and all was kind of well again. But he learned his lesson. This time, he says, I said we want Ronnie for the future. I didn't expect that we were going to have a resignation, and Jerry Ford, and Jimmy Carter. But the Lord works in strange ways, okay? Now, I want to tell you one Reagan story, and as the rest of you can say, you can read it in a book, as they like to say. Buckley met Reagan First of all, Reagan was aware of Buckley long before Buckley was aware of Reagan. I told you about Buckley's youth. Trust me, he didn't spend his Saturdays watching B films with Ronald Reagan and Bedtime for Bonzo. I mean, he was sailing, he was debating, he was, doing things I told you about. But Reagan, when his career in Hollywood had hit the skids, he gets a job as a spokesman for General Electric products. Now, products are a business. If you go to the Reagan Library, I hate to mention the competition, but, we're all friends. You go to the Reagan Library, you can see Reagan's commentary at GE Theater. And you can see Ronnie Reagan and Nancy Reagan and the two little kids doing a commercial pushing all General Electric products. Now, here they're having breakfast. Nancy, in an evening gown, is pouring coffee for Reagan, who's driving to work, right? Ronnie Reagan Jr. is playing pop-up tarts in the new GE toaster, but you have to give the first slice to your sister, Patty, right? Who's not at all interested, right? And there's a new GE freezer, and there's a new GE dishwasher to make Nancy's life easier, as Nancy ever did her dishes herself. You get it. And he's crossing the country giving rallies, speeches to bolster the morale of the company and selling capitalism, if you want. And his boss says, you ought to read this really cool magazine by this young kid, just got out of Yale, picking a fight with his alma mater, picking a fight with Ike, and you get some good lines. Well, Reagan gets mesmerized. And Buckley, Reagan said, did more to make Reagan a conservative and more to make that conservative president than any other person, including Ronald Reagan. Usually we think of a mentor comes along and takes a younger person under his wing, teaches him or her the business or the skill or how to get ahead in life. Here we have a younger man teaching the older man not just how to reinvent himself, but why this is the better philosophy and how we can get organized. So by the time Reagan runs for governor, they meet in 1961. You can read the story in the book. It's fascinating. And they hit a great friendship. So by the time Ronnie is running for governor, first of all, Jimmy Stewart once said that if Ronald Reagan had met Nancy before he met Jane Wyman, he never would have been president. He would have had all the great parts in the movies. The parts that went to Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart and Jimmy Stewart, right? And Jimmy says, and aren't we glad that it never happened? Well, Ronnie is running for governor. Bill gets a care package from Nancy Reagan. Dear Bill, I know you don't follow much about agricultural problems in Northern California. Why would you? But Ronnie is taking a swing through those counties next week. And in the event that you choose to write about them, his positions are underlined in red. Right? She will do the same thing when Ronald Reagan is pushing the INF Treaty to reduce nuclear weapons and eliminate an entire field of nuclear weapons, and Buckley and the right are against the treaty. She sends him another care package. And I've spoken to several nuclear experts, Bill, and I think if you read these things, it might affect your next column. Well, trust me, such a care package never went out for Michelle Obama or any of the other recent first ladies. And in the case of Hillary, it probably would have had the opposite effect of what she intended. But Nancy Reagan and William F. Buckley formed the most effective political consulting company, I think, in the history of the United States. Once Reagan is elected, Buckley decides, you know, my job is kind of over. I'm going to spend more time on private things. I'm going to write my column and write my novels. But you know, the only favor I can do for him is recommend people. He recommends all of Reagan's staff writers. The fellow who wrote Evil Empire was Tony Dolan, a young fellow that Buckley had been mentoring since he was at Yale. And he stayed with Reagan the whole time. But the Evil Empire comment, the ash heap of history comment. Peter Robinson, another Buckley protege, wrote the speech, Tear Down This Wall, right? So Buckley often said, I'm not Reagan's ventriloquist, even if you might think so on occasion. But several other people, ambassadors, judges, all down the line. He wrote a letter to Reagan when Reagan was elected, basically said two things. One, I don't want anything. But two, in filling your administration, bear in mind, you don't want people who want to build their resumes on you. You want people who have to beg to accept the job, which means a pay cut to serve. Why don't we take one or two, and then my editor would demand that I go outside to sign some books. As Buckley used to say, for $5 I will, and for $25 I won't. But are there any questions you'd like to throw at me? Yes, sir, please. Thank you.
A few years back, there was a very fine documentary called The Best of Enemies.
Yeah.
It kind of profiled Gore Vidal's relationship with Buckley. And at the end of the documentary, both Buckley and Vidal seemed to have such a feeling of despair about their lives. How do you explain that with regard to William Buckley?
Well, I don't think he had despair in his life. And, you know, the last year or so, I mean, his wife, who I didn't talk about earlier, was the love of his life, and she died 6 months before he did. And he once said if he was not a religious Catholic, he would think of ending his own life. But the fact that he might see her again stopped him. I don't think that had anything to do with Vidal. What you saw was they have this exchange, okay? And Vidal calls him a crypto-Nazi. And he responds by, well, first of all, the Holocaust was only over 20 years at that point. Many of the soldiers were still around and they were at the height of their careers now. And to have somebody go on television and call, a known person, and call somebody else a Nazi, that was kind of a career ender. And he had sued other people who had called conservatives that, so there was a history here. And he responded in such a way that he made a reference to Vidal's at least bisexuality in an unfavorable term that was used at the time. And he was getting lots of fan letters, and thank you for putting that SOB in his place. The letters read, and he would write back, no, there's nothing to be proud of in losing your temper in public. And so he hadn't seen that film, that exchange, for 30, 40 years when it was put to him. And I think that just shocked him, because he even said, I thought that tape hadn't survived. He was reminded of an unpleasant experience. Vidal is a weirder case, because if you really hate someone, why would you build a shrine to them in your home? Now, he had a room in his villa in Raffaello, Italy, on the Amalfi Coast, a beautiful part of the country. And the room would be filled with black and white pictures on the walls of their exchange. Well, I mean, I don't get that. So I think that kind of was an obsession. I recommend the documentary. Remember, both men will live another 40 years after their exchange in 1968. They both die in the early 80s. And I would say, in both cases, their life work was ahead of them. Vidal writes them of his best literary criticism after that exchange. And Buckley, of course, was now becoming an influential player in both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, so that was still to come. I recommend it. It's called Best of Enemies. You can get it on Netflix. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes, I can't see. Yes.
Right
Oh, there. Oh, Jonathan, yes.
As a conservative,
Yes.
what do you think William F. Buckley would have thought of, if he were alive, would have thought of President Trump's State of the Union speech tonight?
Okay. This will be the last one, because I do want to sign some books. I keep saying read it, I have to let you, right? It's complicated. He would say two things, and I'm as his biographer, not as his press secretary, so I should make that clear. It's hard to put words in people's mouths they're not around, and I'm not going to do that. But I know that Buckley was a free trader all his life. He risked, again, advertisers and supporters when he came out for NAFTA. And he said he wasn't going to change his view on NAFTA just because Bill Clinton was introducing it. The president he didn't think much of. So he would have had some issues with some of the things Trump had said today. He wouldn't think these agreements are necessarily bad for American business, although he would care about workers. When he ran for New York City, he did very well in the outer boroughs, working class New Yorkers. They got him. They knew what he was talking about. They knew that he cared about them. He was talking about their children who were either forced to attend overcrowded schools or doubly taxed if they sent them to private schools. So Buckley introduces vouchers, another issue in his campaign. Okay. And having been a supporter of the Kennedy tax cuts, which his exchange with Nixon, where he says, how come Democrats can cut marginal tax rates and not be accused of helping their friends? Well, he wasn't going to say that I don't want this tax cut when I supported it under Reagan and supported it when Kennedy proposed it. On the other hand, Buckley did a great deal to elevate the debate, very much so. Politics was much civil, with the exception of the Vidal exchange. You never saw that on firing line. You saw the best come out. And I think he would have some real problems with those rallies we've seen. And, it might be funny to say, beat him up, throw him out of here, call demonstrators SOBs, and be happy that they're being beaten up, or say he was going to pay for their lawyers and that kind of stuff. He despised vulgarity and all its forms. One more thing, and I think the most important thing would be, He did write one line about Trump in 2000 when Trump was thinking of running as a liberal on the Reform Party. And he said he wanted to see less personality and more program. He didn't see much of a commitment to ideology, at least in 2000. We don't know what he'd say now. And cult of personality. He didn't like the I of anyone. What about the we? But I think his greatest contempt would probably be for Congress. Remember, in Calvin Coolidge's day, the president wasn't expected to have a program. Congress was supposed to have a program. Congress would pass tax cuts, and Calvin would sign them. Congress would pass laws about restrictive immigration, and Calvin would sign them. And the idea that a separate branch, a branch that Madison said was the preeminent branch in our government, which is why it's mentioned first in the Constitution, would see itself, whoever the president is, Reagan or Johnson or anybody else, as presidential aides. He would call Ryan in and say, you're responsible for a second branch government. You want to do something about immigration? Why don't you pass a bill and send it to him? Get a conversation going. Don't just wait for him to have a program. And out of that conflict would emerge better legislation. I think that's what he'd say. We'll never know, but elevate the debate. I'll let others decide if Donald Trump could have hosted Firing Line. I mean, Firing Line was not The Apprentice. I know it was a different place and time. But I think the role of the presidency, I think he would say, was much more than agreeing with your program. You're the personification of the nation. You're supposed to be a role model for the children. Some of the speeches he gave, particularly the one at the Boy Scouts and some other things, I don't think would have passed muster with him, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you, Marcel. Please give Alvin Felzenberg a round of applause. A Man and His Presidents is available for purchase in the museum store, and I will meet every one of you and sign your books if you'd like. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.